The 40-70 Rule. Former U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell has a rule of thumb about coming to a point of action. He says that anytime you face a hard choice, you should have no less than 40% and no more than 70% of the information you need to make that decision. In that range, you have enough knowledge to make an informed choice, but not so much intelligence that you lose your resolve and inject hesitation and paralysis into your considerations. If you have less than 40% of the information you need, you're essentially shooting from the hip. You don't know quite enough to move forward and will probably make a lot of mistakes. Conversely, if you chase down more data until you get more than 70% of what you need, and it's unlikely that you'll truly need anything above this level, you could get overwhelmed and become uncertain. The opportunity may have passed you by, and someone else may have beaten you by starting already. This is the zone of inaction. You want 100% information, and although it's never possible, it's a zone of safety. Safety from uncertainty, insecurity, and all the rest. But in that sweet spot between 40 and 70%, you have enough to go on and can let your intuition guide your decisions. In the context of Colin Powell, this is where effective leaders are made. The people whose instincts point in the right direction are the ones who will lead their organization to success. This is also where you should battle procrastination before it becomes too late. You should feel a certain amount of uncertainty, or even lack of confidence. It's natural, and anything else is an unrealistic expectation. More often than not, what you're searching for will only be gained through beginning. As mentioned, the first step will be your most valuable tool in learning and preparation, rather than hours of planning. We can replace the word information with other motivators. 40 to 70% of experience, 40 to 70% reading or learning, 40 to 70% confidence, or 40 to 70% planning. While we're taking action, we learn, gain confidence, and gain momentum. When you try to achieve more than 70% information, or confidence, experience, etc., your lack of speed can destroy your momentum or stem your interest, effectively meaning nothing's going to happen. There's a high likelihood of gaining nothing further from surpassing this threshold. For example, let's say you're opening up a cocktail bar, which involves buying a lot of different types of liquor. You're going to wait until you're 100% ready with your liquor before opening. Yet, you can't expect to have absolutely all the liquor you'll ever need when the doors are ready to open. It's impossible to be able to serve any drink a customer orders. So, applying this rule, you'd wait until you had at least 40% of your available inventory prepared. This would establish momentum. Then, if you get more than half of what you need, you'd be in pretty good shape to open. You might not be able to make absolutely every drink in the bartender's guide, but you'll have enough on hand to cover the staple drinks with a couple variations. If you have around 50 to 60% inventory, you're more than ready. When the remaining inventory arrives, you'll already be in action and can just incorporate that new inventory into your offerings. If you waited until you had 70% or more inventory to open, you could find yourself stuck in neutral for longer than you wanted to be. Imagine what would happen if you waited until you had 100% of what you needed. Rare vintages of wines and exotic vodkas from across the world. You'd never open. So let's simplify. If you want to arrange a date, you only need 3 elements: who, when, and where. If you need to find a hospital, you only need to know the specialist you want to see, the cost, and the location. If you want to start a business, you only need to think about what you can do tomorrow to move toward your goal, not necessarily what your ideal business is. You'll end up with more action than not. Waiting until you have 40% of what you need to make a move isn't a way of staying inside your comfort zone. You're actively planning what you need to do to get out, which is just fine, as long as it's not over-planning. For all intents and purposes, the minimum effective dose of information or preparation you need is far lower than you imagine it to be. Beat indecision. Action has many enemies: excessive planning, perfectionism, fear, laziness, just to name a few. It's a shame, because each of those enemies, despite whatever protective instinct they fulfill, only serves one purpose: to keep you still. An underestimated enemy of action is indecision. Unlike other parts of inaction that are plagued by laziness or plain avoidance, you may actually have a good intent with indecision. You want to take action, but the problem is that you're incapable of choosing from what's in front of you. In part, the don't-do list and pre-mortem analysis can help you with indecision, but here are some specific ways to make decisions quicker than you ever thought possible. The first point on defeating indecision is to realize that almost every choice is reversible to some degree. Almost nothing is forever and immediately harmful. There's usually some sort of grace period when nothing is permanent if you don't wish it to be. Therefore, it makes sense to dip your toes into one option to see what happens and gain some information instead of standing at the fork in the road until you starve to death. Make a decision with the full intent of backtracking. You'll feel better making it because you see an easy route out, but you've just broken your inertia. You can learn so much more by taking an option, even for a bit, than from hemming and hawing at the crossroads. Only in the process will you learn more about it and how it feels. In essence, commit to an option and follow it for a while, because it's probably reversible, and you learn more from committing and following through. If you are trying to decide between moving to New York or Texas, are you going to gain more information by visiting neither and continuing to debate with yourself? Or by visiting one, seeing how you feel about it, and going through some motions to gain information? You'd visit Texas and start looking into rental prices, how to attain your driver's license, the local job economy, and the prevalence of healthy food. Make a small commitment, follow the path, and then reevaluate again. The important part is getting away from complete stillness. Second, apply strict boundaries to help you make the choice for you. This streamlines your process and reduces the amount of thinking you have to do. For example, if you're struggling with what restaurant to pick for dinner, you might apply filters of healthy, inexpensive, within a 10-minute drive, and not hamburgers. After you set these parameters, you might only have one or two choices left over. It's like when you shop online and apply filters for size, style, price, and color. Suddenly, you're left with only 2 shirts to buy. If you're left with 0 choices, remove 1 or 2 filters and work backward until you can make an easy yet satisfactory decision. You'll be left with options that are within your criteria, and at that point, what does it really matter? You can choose at random at this point with no loss in happiness or effectiveness, and you've successfully ignored everything that you don't care about. A corollary to setting boundaries is to first identify a default choice if you can't decide within a set amount of time. Pick your default up front, and then set a time limit where if you can't choose something else, you automatically go with the default. For instance, with your significant other, your default restaurant is an Italian joint. If you can't choose a different restaurant within 5 minutes, then to Italy you go. This saves time, but the act of creating the default is important because you'll have automatically selected something that fits your requirements or desires. You'll be happy in either case, in other words. In many instances, the default is what you had in mind the entire time, and where you're probably going to end up regardless of the endless debate. You go through the mental exercise of choosing a default with the idea that you accept ending up there, even if you considered other choices. For the third aspect of conquering indecisiveness, realize that you might have a drive to make the perfect decision with absolutely no downsides, no opportunity costs, and no second thoughts. Well, that's tough to do on a daily basis. Instead of seeking perfection, seek satisfaction of your needs. That's what really matters for 99% of our decisions. If something checks all your boxes, that's all you need to beat your indecision. When you aim for perfection, you tend to start running up against the law of diminishing returns, which states that the amount of effort you put into something is no longer worth the return you gain. Oh, and a perfect decision is also usually impossible or non-existent. For example, you might spend $100 on a pair of nice shoes. At that price point, they'll be well constructed, sturdy and fashionable. What if you were to spend $2,000 on a similar pair of shoes? They'd still be well constructed, sturdy, and fashionable. So in most instances, consider the primary goal of your action. Shoes take you from point A to point B and should contain a modicum of style. This begs the question, were the price of your shoes worth the extra money over the cheaper pair? For most people, no. There's a law of diminishing returns where the more expensive shoes don't make a difference in any relevant way. How nice can a pair of shoes get? Unless the more expensive shoes are self-cleaning with automatic lacing, you're spending more for essentially the same return. You probably aren't shooting for life-changing restaurants every night of the week. In this case, your compulsion to make a perfect choice is wasted energy. Eating is the goal, not choosing a perfect meal. Unless you're making life-impacting choices that you will feel the repercussions of for years, attempting to make a perfect choice is silly. The difference between the perfect choice and the good enough choice will be negligible, and you might not even feel it or remember it the next day. There won't be consequences that make a difference in the long term, so what's the sense in spending additional time on it? In fact, aim for adequate, or even imperfect and flawed. Suddenly, you'll see that it's far easier to make a decision if you lighten up the standards that you've probably arbitrarily placed on yourself. A famous comedian has clever input on this matter. My rule is that if you have someone or something that gets 70% approval, you just do it, because here's what happens. The fact that other options go away immediately brings your choice to 80 because the pain of deciding is over. This is surprisingly similar to what former Secretary of State Colin Powell has to say on the matter. Fourth, to make better and quicker decisions, engage in intentionally judgmental thinking. This is the type of thinking you've probably tried to repress, but it will be very beneficial for your decision-making. Think in black and white terms and reduce your decisions down to 1 to 3 main points. Overgeneralize and don't look at the subtleties of your options. Willfully ignore the gray area and don't rationalize or justify statements by saying, but, or, that's not always true. Focus on what really moves the needle for you and ignore things that, while they matter, aren't the most important. Sometimes, consuming less information will help this process because you're focused on a smaller set of factors. Let's go back to the example of choosing a restaurant for dinner. How can you think more in black and white terms about something like this? Simply reduce your restaurant choices down to what you might categorize as a first impression. Restaurant A is a place for burgers, despite the fact that there are 5 menu items that are not burgers. It doesn't matter. In black and white terms, it's a burger place. Restaurant B is expensive, despite the fact that it has 5 cheaper items. It doesn't matter. In black and white terms, it's expensive. Restaurant C is far away, even though if you hit good traffic, it's not too far. It doesn't matter. In black and white terms, it is far. Seeing options in black and white basically generalizes their traits and removes their subtleties. Remember, if we're talking about destroying indecision, this is one of the best things you can do. If you have a hazy stereotype of your 2 options and the stakes are relatively low, then that's all the information you need. A final method to be intentionally judgmental is to sum up your options in one short sentence only. No commas or addendums allowed. You aren't allowed to elaborate on anything. When you try this, you'll notice you can only end up with broad strokes, such as, it's a burger place that's 10 minutes away, versus, well, they serve burgers, but they also have lasagna and tacos. It's 10 minutes away, but I think we can get there faster. Which one is going to be easier for you to ignore or accept? Remember, the idea is faster action and not necessarily trying to optimize every decision that you come across. Making quick decisions is certainly a major pillar in erring on the side of action. Consider that indecision is another name for overthinking, and remember, we can't think and do at the same time. For the purposes of this book, motion is always preferred to analysis. beyond a certain extent. Take rapid action. Get productive, motivated, and energized. Stop overthinking and procrastinating. Written by Patrick King. Narrated by Russell Newton.